From the nation's capital in Washington, D.C., Cole on Congress. The program discussing national issues that affect Oklahoma. Your host, U.S. Representative Tom Cole.
Thank you for joining me today for another episode of Cole on Congress. Our guest today is considered one of the foremost experts in Congress on matters of national security, Representative Peter King. He's the ranking member on the Homeland Security Committee representing the 3rd District of New York. I'm pleased to have him here with us today to discuss national security issues. Welcome to the show. Good to have you here.
Tom, great to be here. Thank you.
Got to start off and say I had the good fortune of actually being the executive director of the NRCC in 1992 when you first were elected to Congress. You've had quite a long and distinguished career here.
Well, that was one of your first miracles, getting me elected. It was a tight race. I was outspent 4-1, but I won it. Now I'm in my 16th year, so it's it was great having you here now, right actually in the halls with us.
Well, it's fun to be here. And I want to talk in a minute about your literary career, too, because we don't have a lot of novelists in the Congress of the United States. You're much more learned and a little bit more literary than most of us. But let me start with your really critical role on Homeland Security, because you're really at the center of preventing the tragedy from occurring that you really saw and had a personal experience with because your district was so clearly impacted by 9/11. If you could, start a little bit and talk to us about that particular experience and how it impacted you and your viewpoint.
Yeah, I mean, everyone has a story to tell about September 11th. In my case, though, I live right outside New York City. Many of my constituents work in the city. I lost probably 150 constituents. I say probably. Some have just moved out of the district. Some had just moved into the district. But 150 is the approximate number. And there were many, many more who I knew, friends of mine who were killed. So it had a real impact. I mean, to this day, you can't walk more than a few blocks without seeing a street sign after someone who was killed that day. So it was very personal to me, but also personal to really anyone who was in the New York area. And I think the very good thing was personal to everybody in the country. Everyone was affected by it. To some extent or another. But in my case, I just felt a particular obligation. And also my father had been a police officer in New York, and I knew what they were up against there, and I knew that this threat was going to continue. So I really dedicated myself to Homeland Security. And then when Speaker Hastert formed a select committee on Homeland Security in the next Congress, I fought hard to get on the committee. Then it became a permanent committee. I fought hard to get on that. And then in the summer of 2005, there was a vacancy when the President appointed the chairman, Chris Cox, to be the head of the Securities and Exchange Commission. So I ran for position of chairman. I jumped over 4 guys in seniority. It was a tough race, but I won it. And the reason I did it was not just to be chairman of a committee, but I saw several things. One, this is an ongoing threat. I mean, one of the prerogatives, if you will, I get as then as chairman and now as ranking member of the committee is we get these regular briefings on the threats against the nation. And at any given time, there's real threats, there's possible threats, there's others we're not certain exactly what they mean. We're just getting different signals from around the world. So this is ongoing. We've stopped 21 to 22 real threats against the country. We can't let our guard down, but my concern is we've gone now 6.5 years without an attack. And the longer we go, the longer this just goes into the recesses of people's minds. They forget how horrible it was on September 11th and 12th and 13th. When we all thought we'd never forget it. I think too many people do forget it. Then you have people in Congress who try to take away the tools that we need, such as electronic surveillance and constant infiltration of various groups in this country, working with foreign governments. And I think there's a danger of being pushed to the back burner. So I look upon it as a real personal obligation I have. And obviously coming from New York, which is a main target, I have a particular interest. But I can tell you there are threats all over the country, and that's what we have to really keep in mind.
It is dramatic, and we had that experience in Oklahoma in a domestic terrorist incident in the Oklahoma City bombing. I frankly got wonderful help from New York. I was Secretary of State at the time and working very closely with Governor Keating, was kind of placed in charge of some of the federal assistance efforts and liaison with the federal government. But it is dramatic when it happens in your home area. Let me ask you this. I want to talk about some of those, or ask you about some of the measures that have been taken, your assessment of what we've done well, what we need to work on further. Let's just start with the Patriot Act, which was the initial reaction in terms of domestic security. What's your judgment 6 years down the road as to how well that legislation has worked?
Patriot Act has worked very well. For years, we had all of these silos of intelligence, where the FBI had its intelligence, the CIA had its intelligence, the DIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, had its own. And I don't think many of us realize there's more than 30 of these different intelligence agencies in Washington, and they're each going their own way. In some cases, they just didn't share information. In others, they felt they couldn't legally do it, like the FBI and the CIA. That's all been changed. And not everybody in those departments and agencies fully cooperates, but it's much, much better. It's probably 90% better than it was on September 11th. They also then share that information down with local governments, which they didn't do in the past. We would have instances where the FBI wouldn't cooperate with the local police, and you had these turf battles going on, and that's one of the reasons why September 11th happened. September 11th, it would be almost impossible for that attack to happen again. I mean, looking at it now, there were just so many footprints they left behind, or fingerprints they left behind. But because the enemy always adapts too, and we're trying to adapt to it. But no, the Patriot Act gave us the tools we needed. And as far as roving wiretaps, for instance, it used to be you had to get a court order for every wiretap, and so every time one of these people got a new cell phone, you had to go out and get a new tap. So now you can actually get the authorization against the individual rather than the phone. But we have to do more. We have the NSA. That was the one that was really criticized, where we were surveilling phone calls made from suspected terrorists overseas into the United States, and that's being held up. I mean, that was very successful, very important. Then it ended up in page 1 of the New York Times, and the Washington Post wrote about it, which hampered us enough. And now it's been really tied up by the Democrats in Congress, unfortunately. And that is really hurting our intelligence gathering network. You know, it's interesting. The person who first proposed that was General Hayden, who was head of the NSA, the National Surveillance Agency. National Security Agency, and he was actually appointed to that job by President Clinton. This was not some George Bush partisan. He was a career military and intelligence officer who said we had to do this. We had to follow these phone calls coming into the States. Then you have the situation where if a person in Pakistan is making a call to somebody in Afghanistan, and I don't begin to understand the technology, but that call gets routed through the United States, they're saying we need a court order to intercept that, even though it's from two alleged terrorists calling each other overseas.
Well, as you suggest in your remarks, one of the big concerns, at least the publicly expressed concerns on both the Patriot Act and FISA reform are, somehow the rights of American citizens are being tampered with. Now, you're a pretty fierce defender of the right of free expression and privacy in your career. Where are the areas do you see this as a serious danger, and if so, what are the things that need to be done about that?
No, I really don't. I'll say this. First of all, there's always a danger the government can overreach, but they could do that anyway. I mean, the government, and the idea is we have to monitor, we have to watch what they're doing, and we do that. But the fact is, you can't be, I mean, what happened with the National Intelligence Surveillance, or FISA, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, is that the president would, every several months, that would be made available to the courts. They could look at it, they could analyze, they could see. So we recorded every conversation was being intercepted. We logged it, we kept track of it. So if there is any abuse, that would be discovered. This is all, and I don't even know if this is required by the law, but the president was doing it anyway to ensure against any type of abuse. I mean, if the government wants to abuse and put a tap on someone's phone, they can try it, and they can maybe get away with it unless we catch them. But in this situation, the president was actually coming forward and saying, we are going to be having surveillance of this person's phone. These are the ones we've done over the last 60 or 90 days. So we were laying out, or the government was laying out, what surveillance they were doing. So no, we always have to be on the lookout, but this right that the government had, I don't think in any way was infringing on our rights, because if the government wants to abuse, they could do it anyway. This actually was making the government much more accountable and ensuring that everything would be done according to a format. Even, for instance, one thing that was really ridiculed a lot was the idea that you could get someone's library records, and it was somehow assumed that the people in the administration wanted to know what books the people were reading. The real reason for that was, in a number of cases, going back over the years with some high-profile cases, the person would actually go to the library to take a particular book out. For instance, I think the Zodiac Killer, that's one of the ways he was captured, was by different books he had read which tied directly into the murders that he had committed. But for instance, let's say you have information indicating that a person is going to take down a particular building. They're going to attack a certain building. You're not certain, again, how conclusive the evidence is, but it really leads to this conclusion. Then you find out he's gone to a local library and taken out the plans for that building. Well, then it becomes part of the overall case. That's what we're looking for, not the political books the person is reading or the novels they're reading, or anything like that. We're talking about something that ties directly to the case for which that person is being investigated.
What about situations, again, under FISA? One of the big discussions in Congress has been whether or not telecommunications companies need retroactive immunity for cooperation. You know a lot more about this than most people. Number one, how critical is their cooperation, and how legitimate is that concern that they have that they could be sued for cooperating with requests to the government?
The cooperation of the telecommunications companies is absolutely essential. We can't do it without them. I mean, they're the ones who have all the systems in place. So without the cooperation of telephone companies, telecommunications industry, this could not have been done. And the administration went to them. Our national leaders went to these companies after September 11th and said, this is essential to our national security, to our homeland security. It's in our national interest. And these companies cooperate. They got nothing out of it. There's nothing in it for them. They're not selling the information. They're not marketing at all. They were strictly being patriotic. And now various groups want to bring lawsuits against them. And these companies still want to cooperate, but it raises a real issue, for instance, for their shareholders. If they know they can still be sued in the future and be sued for what's gone on in the past, it can end up bankrupting some of these companies. And that's bad enough for them. But the other situation is that not only is it bad for them, you have trials where it would be coming out in discovery proceedings what the government did, what the telephone companies did, and that the only one who benefits from that is the enemy, because they can then see what our procedures are, what our tactics are, and it would be so damaging. And I'll give you another example of that, not involving telecommunications companies, but involving foreign banks. Many countries and many leaders in different countries attack the United States, and they criticize us, they attack us, the war on terrorism, but privately they're cooperating with us. I mean, they have to do it for local consumption, criticize us, being very cooperative. And many of the banks in these countries, at the request of their governments, was allowing us to track terrorist financing. And they would tell us when money was being transferred, to whom it was being transferred, what the amounts were, all of that information. All of which, by the way, is perfectly legal under American law. But these banks and these countries were doing it to assist us, but they obviously wanted it kept secret. Well, the New York Times put this on page 1. They made a big production out of it, even though it was totally legal. As a result of that, it caused us real problems of cooperation with these governments and these banks, because they couldn't believe that an American paper would do that without getting the approval of the government. And so that has really hampered us, because that, and also the terrorists did not know that we had such a sophisticated way of tracking their transactions. So after that, several things happened. One, they started altering their methods of transferring money. Secondly, it became a lot harder and difficult to get governments and banks to cooperate with us, and really hurt our intelligence agencies overall.
You know, from your unique perspective, what are the things that we ought to be doing now that we have not been able to accomplish? And what going forward are the types of additional measures you think we ought to take?
I think we should be increasing surveillance, and we also should be, well, definitely give immunity, to the telephone companies. And here in this country, we have to adjust more how we give the funding to different states and localities. We should be giving it to areas that need it, and we should be including, obviously, Islamic terrorism, but also domestic terrorism. You saw that in Oklahoma City, how terrible that was. And if I just digress there for a moment, one of the just like, when New York was attacked, a lot of fire departments and policemen around the country came to help us. I know the New York City Fire Department sent representatives out to Oklahoma City.
They did. As a matter of fact, the fire chief who died.
That's what I mentioned, Ray Downey, yeah.
Absolutely. It couldn't have been better to us. And, we sent, I know, groups and help as quickly as we possibly could, because we'd gotten such spectacular support from all over the country, but certainly from New York.
As I was going to say, Ray Downey was actually killed on September 11th. He was back in New York then, and he was killed. And, His home actually is in my district now, and his son's a good friend of mine. So there was a case of really it involves all Americans.
Well, that response, I remember the Oklahoma City response was really a remarkable response, and but there was a sort of vein of interpretation in the press that, well, this is a rather homogeneous community. It's a deeply religious. It's a frontier community. It's not secular, multiracial, multi-ethnic America. And yet the response in New York was precisely the same thing. It was sort of how Americans respond when trouble comes. I thought it was one of the more remarkable things, what those firefighters and police officers did, the countless individual acts of heroism by just average people trying to help other people at a time of great stress. I mean, the people on Flight 93 that once they had an understanding of what was going on struck back. I think it was the tragedy was terrible. The response was really magnificent on the part of the average Americans.
Yeah, it shows what Americans are really all about. And getting back to your question about what we should be doing, we do a lot as far as Homeland Security, as far as getting the best technology we can over here and the best ways to respond to an attack. But the problem is that if the enemy, once they get here and they're able to formulate their plan, get it together, it's going to be very difficult to stop them. We can minimize it, we can mitigate it, and we can respond quickly, but odds are they can be successful. The idea is to stop it before it gets that far. And that involves really being aggressive overseas as well. And that's why I believe these tough interrogations are essential. I think it'd be a terrible mistake to be closing down Guantanamo unless we decide what we're going to do with these people.
I couldn't agree with you more. One of the potential sites for the relocation of some of those prisoners is Fort Sill, which is in my district, which frankly is not a maximum security type of facility. You don't have people there with the language abilities, the concentration of experts, the expense involved in this, and I can't see the gain. It's a PR gain. Then you've got the same problem across a half a dozen locations inside the continental United States. It just makes absolutely no sense to me.
And I just think it's wrong to be saying that there are constitutional rights for people who are captured terrorists. I mean, we're not talking about American citizens. We're not talking about people who are even legitimate prisoners of war. And no one's talking about doing anything other than really tough interrogations if they're needed. And the irony is with Guantanamo, because I was actually dealing with one of the foreign governments at the time, and the head of that country was publicly demanding that we send, and it was several prisoners back. That was what he was saying publicly. Privately, he was saying keep them here because the last thing we want is them back in our country because their laws wouldn't allow them to hold them. They would have to release them once we returned them. So there was a public outcry in that particular country saying these people are being held by these evil Americans and we want them returned. But privately it was telling us, keep these guys as long as you can. The last thing we want is them back here.
That is one of the more dramatic problems that you have, though, is governments that will tell you one thing privately and then feel like they have to say another thing publicly. Because most Americans think we get absolutely no cooperation. When the reality is you couldn't sustain the American effort in Iraq without overflights over many countries that are critical of the policy but clearly have made their facilities and their airspace, different things available to us. So,
well, even France, during the height of the trouble between Jacques Chirac and President Bush during the lead up to the Iraq War and during the Iraq War, during that time we were getting tremendous cooperation from the French intelligence agencies because they have such a large, unassimilated Muslim population in their country, and they are petrified of an attack within their country. So they are one of the most cooperative as far as exchanging information with us, which obviously, Chirac was not bragging about that at the time, but for their own survival, they were sharing information with us. And, giving us basically everything we needed, and we were sharing it with them. So again, there is a lot of hypocrisy too, though. I mean, tremendous amount of hypocrisy, but that's the real world we live in. And you take the information the way you get it, even from governments that on the one hand are criticizing us, but on the other hand are begging us for assistance.
Well, and again, in the Muslim world too, we had to use the phrase Islamic terrorism, but the reality is we have, of course, many Muslims that do cooperate with us. These are not people that could win an election, a free election, any place, I think, in the Islamic world. They are really, you saw what happened to al-Qaeda when it took root temporarily in the Sunni areas in Iraq. I mean, I've been to Ramadi and talked to some of the people. People turned on them when they saw what their vision is for the future. That is not something that Muslims want, to take root and flower in their part of the world any more than we would in ours. It's just people that have perverted that religion.
They've totally perverted it, and there's really two issues that come out of that. One is here in the United States, I don't believe we get enough cooperation from people in the Muslim community. That's something we have to work on, and I think we should speak out and say so, because the overwhelming majority of Muslims are really law-abiding Americans, but many of their leaders have chosen not to really be as cooperative as they should be. But also in overseas, like you mentioned, being in Ramadi, and how really Al-Qaeda has been largely devastated and defeated in Iraq. It's hanging on, and we have to finish the job against Al-Qaeda, because the rest of the Muslim world, and not just the radicals, the rest of the Muslim world is watching to see if we are serious about it. And if we can defeat Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Now, whether or not they were there before the war, the fact is they chose to make it a battlefield. And that's going to be looked at as to whether or not we stand strong and defeat them. If we do, it is going to be a devastating defeat for bin Laden and for Iraq.
I couldn't agree more. Let me bring you a little closer to home, because one of the issues that we're all dealing with now are the consequences flowing out of the Real ID Act that Congress passed a couple years ago, basically trying to toughen up the requirements for states in terms of driver's license and have some degree of uniformity, some ability to check. Where are we at in that process now, in your opinion? What do we need to do going forward? Because we're getting a lot of blowback on it now, although I'm one of these people that think you need to absolutely have really strong standards in terms of issuing government IDs to people.
Yeah, we really do, because I think of the 19 hijackers, I believe 15 to 16 of them had driver's licenses. They had valid government ID. And so it is important that we do have some uniform standards. Basically, 48 of the 50 states are pretty much in compliance or working toward compliance. South Carolina is holding back. I think they've gotten some sort of a temporary extension, but they've been resisting it. I know the governor of South Carolina has been contacting me about it. But the fact is, it is going to cost some extra money. It is going to cause some inconvenience. But we're in a war. This is a war for survival. And again, nobody at the federal government wants, for the fun of it, for everyone to have a standardized driver's license or a standardized ID. But the fact is, we live in a world where people move from state to state. They use driver's licenses as ID on planes and to get into government buildings. And so it's important that we have it standardized. We just can't allow, because the enemy knows where all our weaknesses are. And yes, it is inconvenient, and I think we should try to accommodate it when we can. But there is a certain amount of sacrifice that has to be made too. And I think that this is a legitimate request for the federal government to make on state and local governments. And when there's a particular need we can address, let's do it. But other than that, I think we should make the decision, yes, we are going to cooperate.
A friend of mine who's European came to the United States not too long ago and had not been here in several years. And he said, I'm struck not by how difficult it is to move around in the wake of 9/11, but how easy it is to move around. He said, obviously, it's a little tougher at the airports than it used to be, and you're screened a little bit more closely, but the reality is the ease of access in the United States of America post 9/11 is pretty remarkable.
It really is. I mean, there has not been an overreaction. But getting back to what you said before about areas we have to be concerned about, the airports are very secure. I mean, they're not foolproof, but but it's easier to secure an airport because we control access in and out of airports. You have to go, and also the numbers, for the most part, are very controllable. I mean, there are not that many people flying. I know there's millions, but it can be manageable. The real problem is going to be with mass transit, where you were talking about in a city like New York or Chicago, where you have hundreds and hundreds of entrances and exits and subways and commuter lines overlapping. That's a real concern. Same with passenger trains across the country. It's hard. You can't have metal detectors at every doorway going into a train. People move from car to car, people getting on and off. So that's something where we have to be doing a lot more. We're trying to, but it's a much harder problem to get your arms around.
Well, this is speculative, but I think one of the surprises, again, post 9/11, not only it's no attacks, but none of the kind of incidents we saw in London in 2001 and 5, which are really fairly easy to pull off. I mean, certainly not interested in suggesting a change in tactics to Al-Qaeda, but there's been some reason we haven't seen this lower level, easier to execute type of incidents. It's as if every plan is for something spectacular, blowing up airliners over the Atlantic or 9/11 type scenarios. You have any insight as to why that's the case?
Oh, actually, a lot of the psychology experts are trying to figure that out. There's several things. One, we have done a lot to stop it. But you're right, the low-level attack could be fairly easy to carry out. It's belief that Al-Qaeda, as much as they want a body count, as much as they want carnage, they also want it to be a spectacular event. And if it's just a simple attack, they feel it would hurt them in the eyes of the world and it'll show that they have been weakened. So they are trying to carry out either as far as getting large numbers of people killed or bringing down an historic building or a landmark. But having said that, they also, if they do get desperate, they could, and not giving it away, they could try to do some easy attacks, which is why the intelligence is so important and why it's so important, for instance, to be monitoring when different chemicals are being purchased or different types of explosives are being purchased, and why you have to, for instance, something that a police officer in Oklahoma City or New York City sees may mean nothing to them by itself, but you combine that with FBI intelligence or CIA intelligence, then it means a lot more. That's why the fusion centers and getting it assimilated and brought together means so much, because again, in the abstract, a particular something out of the ordinary. On the other hand, something to the FBI may mean nothing, but to the cop in Oklahoma City, he goes, wait a minute, this ties in directly with what you're hearing, and an FBI agent wouldn't be able to appreciate that. So that's why it is important that we have these joint efforts that are much better than they used to be. Not perfect, but much better.
How comfortable are you that, when we created the Department of Homeland Security, obviously we pulled together an enormous number of different agencies and bureaus and tried to put them and meld them together into a common culture. How comfortable are you that that's succeeding?
It's doing pretty well. I give it, actually we had a hearing last year. We had a pretty extensive hearing. And the conclusion was that the Department of Homeland Security is further along at this stage than the Defense Department was after World War II. But you're talking about 22 different agencies brought together. Now it's over 200,000 employees, many of them with totally different job descriptions, and also with very different cultures. For instance, the Border Patrol had different culture from immigration, and Customs had different from both of them. And now they're working together. You have Customs and Border Protection, so it's you've had that to overcome. But for the most part, it's working well, but there's a lot of room for improvement. We saw with Katrina, there were problems, but to me there's no alternative. You can't go back to having 22 different agencies.
Well, Congressman, this has gone exceptionally fast. I never even got to the part that I wanted to get to about your literary expertise, so I got to get you back to talk about your books sometime. But I just want to thank you, Peter, for coming, and the really extraordinary service that you render our country in your position. You have made an enormous difference in making each and every American safer and their lives better and more secure. And you bring to it not only an expertise but a passion that is just so obvious. And you're impatient for results, and I think that's exactly what Americans want from their representatives. So thanks for the distinguished service you're rendering our country.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you very much. Thanks for having me here today.
Oh, it's great to have you here. They don't hear a lot of this accent in Oklahoma. This will be very educational.
Is there going to be like a translation under it? Or?
I think we'll get it right. Okay. But thanks again, Peter.
Thank you,
Appreciate
Tom.
you coming.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you.
You bet. Thanks.